Sarah Mitchell wiped down the marble tables in the grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. The evening gala was just 3 hours away, and the event staff rushed around her like a choreographed dance she had memorized over 5 years of working there. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting rainbow patterns across the white linen tablecloth she had spent the afternoon pressing and arranging. At 28 years old, Sarah had become invisible to most of the wealthy guests who frequented these events. She was just another face in a black vest and white shirt, someone who smiled politely while refilling champagne glasses and clearing plates of food that cost more than her weekly paycheck. But Sarah didn't mind the invisibility. It gave her time to observe, to dream, and most importantly, to listen to the music that always filled these grand occasions. Tonight's gala was special. The Riverside Hotel was hosting a charity fundraiser for the local children's hospital, and the guest list included senators, business moguls, and even a few celebrities Sarah had only seen on television. The event coordinator, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, had been particularly demanding all week, insisting that everything be perfect down to the last folded napkin. Sarah's hands moved on autopilot as she arranged silverware, her mind drifting to the old upright piano that sat in the corner of the ballroom. It was a beautiful instrument, its dark wood polished to a deep shine, but it was rarely used anymore. The hotel preferred to hire professional musicians with their electronic keyboards and sophisticated sound systems. The old piano had become more decoration than instrument, a relic from a time when the hotel hosted different kinds of gatherings. What none of her co-workers knew was that Sarah had been playing piano since she was 6 years old. Her grandmother, a music teacher, had given her lessons every Sunday afternoon in her tiny apartment across town. Those lessons had been the highlight of Sarah's childhood, a magical escape from the cramped 2-bedroom home she shared with her mother and 3 younger siblings. Her grandmother had told her that music wasn't just sound, it was emotion made audible, and that a truly gifted pianist could make people feel things they didn't even know they were capable of feeling. Sarah had dreamed of attending a music conservatory, of performing in concert halls, of making her grandmother proud, but life had other plans. When Sarah was 17, her grandmother passed away suddenly, and with her went the piano lessons and the dream of a musical career. Sarah's mother needed help supporting the family, so Sarah took the job at the Riverside Hotel right after high school, promising herself it was only temporary. 10 years later, temporary had become permanent. Her younger siblings had grown up and moved away. Her mother had remarried, and Sarah was still at the hotel, still serving champagne to people who never looked her in the eye, still dreaming of music she no longer played. The afternoon flew by in a blur of preparation. The florist arrived with massive arrangements of white roses and orchids. The catering team wheeled in cart after cart of gourmet appetizers. The lighting crew adjusted spotlights and tested the sound system. Sarah worked quietly among the chaos, folding napkins into intricate swan shapes and ensuring each table setting was perfectly aligned. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the ballroom's tall windows, the first guests started to arrive. Sarah changed into her serving uniform, pulling her dark hair back into a neat bun and checking her appearance in the staff bathroom mirror. She looked tired, she thought, noticing the dark circles under her eyes from working double shifts all week. But she forced a smile, the professional one she had perfected over years of service, and headed out to the ballroom floor. The gala was everything Mrs. Patterson had hoped for. Men in expensive tuxedos and women in glittering gowns filled the ballroom, their laughter and conversation creating a pleasant hum beneath the recorded classical music playing through the speakers. Sarah moved smoothly between tables, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres, her trained eyes constantly scanning for empty glasses or guests who might need attention. She noticed a distinguished older gentleman sitting alone at table 7, staring at the old piano in the corner with an expression of deep sadness. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his tuxedo was impeccably tailored. But there was something about his posture, the way his shoulders slumped forward, that suggested a heavy weight on his heart. Sarah approached his table with a tray of champagne. The man looked up as she offered him a glass, and their eyes met for just a moment. In that brief connection, Sarah saw something that surprised her. It wasn't the usual indifference or entitled expectation she was accustomed to from wealthy guests. Instead, she saw recognition, as if he had actually seen her as a person rather than just a server. He took the champagne with a gentle nod, and Sarah noticed his hands were trembling slightly. As she turned to move to the next table, she heard him speak softly, almost to himself. His voice was barely audible over the crowd noise, but Sarah's years of working in the service industry had trained her ears to catch even the quietest requests. He was looking at the piano again, and he said something that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. The words were simple but loaded with emotion that seemed to hang in the air between them. Sarah paused, her professional instinct warring with curiosity. She shouldn't engage with guests beyond the necessary pleasantries. Mrs. Patterson had made that clear many times, but something about this man's sadness called to her, reminded her of her own lost dreams and the music that still lived somewhere deep inside her chest, waiting for a chance to breathe again. Before she could decide whether to speak or move on, Mrs. Patterson's sharp voice cut across the ballroom, calling for all servers to gather near the kitchen entrance. Sarah glanced back at the man one more time, then hurried to join her co-workers, unaware that this evening was about to change everything. Mrs. Patterson stood before the assembled servers with her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest, her expression more stressed than usual. The fundraiser was going well, but there had been an unexpected problem. The hired pianist, a young man from the city who was supposed to provide live music during dinner, had called 30 minutes ago to cancel. His car had broken down on the highway, and there was no way he could make it to the hotel in time. The recorded music playing through the speakers was fine for cocktail hour, Mrs. Patterson explained in her clipped tone, but the program specifically advertised live piano music during the dinner service. Several major donors had specifically mentioned looking forward to it. The hotel's reputation was at stake. She needed someone to find a solution, and fast. Sarah listened to this announcement with a strange flutter in her stomach. The old piano in the corner suddenly seemed to glow in her peripheral vision, calling to her like a siren song. Her fingers tingled with muscle memory, remembering chord progressions and melodies she hadn't played in years. But the thought of volunteering was absurd. She was a waitress, not a performer. What if she had forgotten everything her grandmother taught her? What if she made a fool of herself in front of hundreds of wealthy, important people? The other servers scattered back to their duties, whispering among themselves about the crisis. Mrs. Patterson stood alone, frantically scrolling through her phone, probably trying to find another pianist at the last minute. Sarah found herself walking toward her supervisor before her brain could talk her out of it. Mrs. Patterson looked up irritably when Sarah approached. She was not someone who appreciated interruptions, especially during a high-profile event. But Sarah forced herself to speak, her voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger as she made her offer. She told Mrs. Patterson that she could play piano, that she had studied for years, that she could handle the dinner music if needed. Mrs. Patterson's expression cycled through surprise, skepticism, and then desperate calculation. She looked Sarah up and down as if seeing her for the first time in 5 years. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, clearly weighing the risk of letting an untested server perform against the embarrassment of having no live music at all. Sarah could see the exact moment Mrs. Patterson decided that she had nothing to lose. The answer was yes, but with conditions. Sarah would play during dinner service only. She would stick to classical pieces, nothing experimental or modern. If she made any mistakes or if any guests complained, she would stop immediately and return to her serving duties. Mrs. Patterson would be watching, and this opportunity came with significant risk to Sarah's job if anything went wrong. Sarah nodded, accepting the terms even as her hands started to shake. Mrs. Patterson walked her to the piano, and Sarah sat down on the bench, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone in the ballroom could hear it. The keys were cool under her fingertips as she lifted the fallboard, revealing the ivory and ebony that suddenly felt both foreign and familiar. She began with something safe, a gentle Chopin nocturne her grandmother had loved. The first notes came out hesitant, her fingers stumbling slightly over the keys as rust fell away from muscles that hadn't performed this task in years. But then something magical happened. The music began to flow, and with it came a flood of memories. Her grandmother's apartment with its faded curtains and the smell of lavender. Sunday afternoons filled with scales and arpeggios. The way her grandmother would close her eyes when Sarah played something particularly beautiful, a smile spreading across her weathered face. The ballroom seemed to shift around her. The conversations didn't stop entirely, but they quieted, people pausing mid-sentence to listen, Sarah moved from Chopin to Debussy, her confidence growing with each passing measure. Her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget, dancing across the keys with increasing fluidity and grace. She played pieces she hadn't thought about in a decade, pulling them from some deep reserve in her memory, where they had been waiting patiently for this moment. Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, they all flowed through her fingers and into the room, transforming the atmosphere from merely elegant to something transcendent. Sarah had forgotten what it felt like to lose herself in music, to become a conduit for something larger than her daily struggles and disappointments. As she played, she wasn't a waitress in a worn uniform serving people who never saw her. She was an artist, a storyteller, a keeper of her grandmother's legacy. The piano sang under her hands, its old strings producing tones that were warm and rich, imperfect in a way that made them more beautiful. The dinner service began and Sarah continued playing, letting the music underscore the clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversation. But more and more she noticed people stopping to listen. Servers paused with trays balanced on their hands. Guests set down their forks and turned toward the piano. The distinguished older gentleman from table 7 sat with his eyes closed, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. Sarah played through the main course, through dessert, her repertoire expanding as memories continued to surface. She played pieces her grandmother had performed at recitals, songs from her childhood, melodies that carried joy and sorrow and everything in between. The music poured out of her like water from a broken dam, years of suppressed passion and abandoned dreams finally finding voice. When she finished a particularly moving piece by Rachmaninoff, there was a moment of profound silence in the ballroom. Then unexpectedly applause erupted. Not polite, obligatory clapping, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. People were standing, their faces showing real emotion, real connection to what they had just experienced. Mrs. Patterson approached the piano, and Sarah braced herself for criticism, for the reminder that she had stepped outside her designated role. But instead, her supervisor's face showed something Sarah had never seen there before: respect. Mrs. Patterson told her that several guests had asked who the pianist was, that the evening had become something special because of the music, that Sarah had saved the gala. As Sarah stood from the piano bench, her legs shaky from sitting and from the adrenaline still coursing through her system, she saw the older gentleman from table 7 making his way through the crowd toward her. His face was still wet with tears, but he was smiling now, a smile that transformed his entire appearance from sad to radiant. He reached out his hand to her, and when she took it, he held it gently, as if she were something precious and fragile. What he said next would set in motion a series of events that Sarah could never have imagined. Events that would prove her grandmother right about the power of music to change lives. The gentleman introduced himself as Robert Chen, and his handshake was firm despite the emotion still visible in his eyes. He spoke with a refined accent that suggested education and travel, telling Sarah that her performance had moved him deeply. The way he looked at her made her feel truly seen for the first time in years, as if her music had somehow revealed her true self to this stranger. Robert explained that he was a patron of the arts, someone who had spent his life supporting musicians and cultural institutions. But more than that, he said, he had been a concert pianist himself once many years ago, before arthritis had stolen his ability to play. The trembling in his hands that Sarah had noticed earlier suddenly made sense. He had been sitting alone, staring at the piano with such sadness because he was mourning the loss of something he loved more than almost anything in the world. Hearing Sarah play had brought back memories of his own performances, Robert said, but it had also done something else. It had reminded him why music mattered, why it was worth supporting young talent, why the world needed artists who could touch people's souls the way Sarah had touched his tonight. He asked if she had ever performed professionally, if she had studied at a conservatory, if she had considered a career in music. Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm as she explained her situation. She told him about her grandmother, about the lessons that had ended too soon, about the dreams she had set aside to help her family. She tried to keep her voice steady as she admitted that tonight was the first time she had played for anyone other than herself in over 10 years. She expected him to lose interest then, to realize she was just a waitress with some childhood training, not a real musician. But Robert's expression only grew more intense. He told her that raw talent combined with genuine emotion was far more valuable than technical perfection without soul. Many of the pianists he supported had impressive credentials and flawless technique, but few of them could make him feel what he had felt listening to her play tonight. He pulled a business card from his wallet and pressed it into her hand, telling her to call him tomorrow because he wanted to discuss her future. Sarah looked at the card, barely processing the words printed there. Robert Chen, founder and director, Chen Foundation for Musical Arts. There was a phone number and an address in the city's most prestigious district. She stammered out a thank you, not quite believing this was really happening, half convinced she would wake up tomorrow and realize the entire evening had been a dream. Other guests approached then, wanting to compliment Sarah's performance, asking where she had trained and where else they could hear her play. Mrs. Patterson hovered nearby, her expression a mixture of pride and confusion, as if she couldn't quite reconcile the talented pianist with the quiet waitress she had supervised for 5 years. Sarah answered questions politely, still feeling like she was floating outside her body, watching this scene unfold from a distance. The gala continued, but Sarah was excused from her serving duties for the rest of the evening. Instead, she found herself swept into conversations with people who actually wanted to know about her music, her influences, her aspirations. A woman who owned an art gallery mentioned that she hosted intimate concerts in her space and would love to feature Sarah. A music teacher from the local university suggested Sarah might consider auditioning for their adult education program, which offered scholarships for promising students. By the time the event ended and the last guests departed, Sarah's head was spinning. She had collected half a dozen business cards and promises of opportunities she had never dared to imagine. The hotel staff cleaned up around her and she helped automatically, falling back into familiar routines even as her mind raced with possibilities. In the staff locker room, Sarah changed back into her street clothes, carefully placing Robert Chen's business card in her wallet. Her coworker Maria, another longtime server, caught her before she left. Maria had worked the gala too and had seen everything that happened. She hugged Sarah tightly, telling her how proud she was, how amazing it had been to watch Sarah shine like that. The walk home through the city streets felt surreal. Sarah's fingers still tingled from playing, muscle memory keeping rhythm with her footsteps. She lived in a small studio apartment in an old building, nothing like the grand homes of the people she had met tonight, but it was hers. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs and unlocked her door, stepping into the familiar space that suddenly felt too small for the dreams expanding in her chest. Sleep was impossible. Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening. Part of her warned against getting too excited, reminded her of all the times life had disappointed her before. But another part, the part that her grandmother had nurtured all those years ago, whispered that this might be the moment everything changed. The next morning, Sarah called the number on Robert Chen's card. A professional-sounding assistant answered and, after Sarah identified herself, immediately connected her to Robert. His voice was warm as he greeted her, asking if she had slept well after such an exciting evening. Then he got straight to the point. He wanted to arrange an audition, a proper one where she could perform for a panel of music professionals he trusted. Sarah's heart raced as she agreed. Robert explained that the Chen Foundation supported emerging artists through grants, mentorship programs, and performance opportunities. If the audition went well, he would sponsor her participation in a summer intensive program that could launch her career. The program included private lessons with renowned instructors, performance opportunities, and connections to the professional music world. The audition was scheduled for 2 weeks later, giving Sarah time to practice and prepare. After hanging up, she realized she would need access to a piano to get ready. Her tiny apartment had no room for an instrument, and she couldn't afford to rent practice space. She thought about the old piano at the hotel, sitting silent in the corner of the ballroom between events. Taking a chance, Sarah called Mrs. Patterson and explained her situation. To her surprise, her supervisor agreed to let her use the ballroom piano during off hours, before the hotel got busy and when no events were scheduled. Mrs. Patterson's voice held a note of warmth Sarah had never heard before, as she wished her good luck with the audition. For the next 2 weeks, Sarah's life fell into a new rhythm. She worked her shifts at the hotel, then stayed late to practice. She woke early on her days off to practice before the hotel got busy. Her fingers slowly regained the strength and agility they had lost during her years away from music. She worked through old pieces and learned new ones, pushing herself harder than she had even as a teenager studying with her grandmother. The other hotel staff became her audience and cheerleaders. Maria would bring her coffee during practice sessions. The maintenance crew would pause their work to listen. Even the stern head chef would stand in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, nodding along to the music. The hotel became a different kind of home, one where Sarah was finally allowed to be her whole self. As the audition date approached, Sarah felt ready, but terrified. This opportunity felt too good to be true, and she kept waiting for something to go wrong. The morning of the audition arrived with unseasonably cool weather, rain pattering against Sarah's window as her alarm went off at 6 a.m. She had barely slept, running through pieces in her mind all night, her fingers twitching against the sheets as if playing invisible keys. The audition was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the Chen Foundation's headquarters, a restored historic building downtown that Sarah had passed countless times but never entered. She dressed carefully in the only professional outfit she owned, a simple black dress she usually reserved for funerals and job interviews. In the mirror, she looked pale and nervous, dark circles under her eyes betraying her sleepless night. Sarah tried to remember her grandmother's advice from years ago. Nerves meant she cared, and caring was what made music meaningful. She just needed to channel that nervous energy into her performance. The Foundation's building was even more impressive up close. Marble steps led to heavy wooden doors, and the lobby featured soaring ceilings with elaborate plasterwork. A receptionist directed Sarah to the 3rd floor, where the audition would take place in a recital hall. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway as she walked, each sound seeming to count down the minutes until she had to prove herself. Robert Chen met her outside the recital hall, his warm smile immediately calming some of her anxiety. He explained that 3 judges would be listening, himself, a piano professor from the State Conservatory, and a concert pianist who had recently retired from touring. They weren't looking for perfection, Robert assured her, but for musicality, emotion, and potential. He squeezed her shoulder gently before opening the door and leading her inside. The recital hall was intimate, with perhaps 50 seats arranged in neat rows facing a beautiful grand piano. The instrument gleamed under soft lighting, its black surface reflecting the room like still water. 3 people sat on the front row with notebooks and score sheets. They looked up as Sarah entered, their expressions professionally neutral, giving nothing away. Robert made brief introductions. The conservatory professor was Dr. Margaret Winters, a stern-looking woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. The retired concert pianist was James Liu, younger than Sarah expected, probably in his early 40s with an easy smile and paint-stained fingers that suggested hobbies beyond music. They greeted Sarah politely but without warmth, their professional demeanor making her even more nervous. Sarah approached the piano, adjusting the bench to the right height and taking a moment to orient herself. The keys felt different than the old upright at the hotel, more responsive and nuanced. She had prepared 3 pieces, a Bach prelude and fugue to demonstrate technical skill, a Chopin nocturne to show her lyrical touch, and a Brahms intermezzo that would test her ability to convey complex emotions. She began with the Bach, her fingers finding their way through the intricate counterpoint. The piece was mathematical in its structure, but Sarah tried to find the humanity in it, the way her grandmother had taught her to look for the heartbeat beneath the notes. She made it through without major errors, though she knew her tempo had wavered in one section where her nerves got the better of her. The Chopin came more naturally. This was music that lived in her soul, melancholy and beautiful, speaking of longing and loss in a language more eloquent than words. Sarah closed her eyes for portions of it, letting muscle memory guide her fingers while she focused on the emotion she wanted to convey. She thought of her grandmother, of all the dreams deferred and hopes abandoned, and poured that bittersweet mixture into every phrase. When she opened her eyes after the final note faded, she saw Dr. Winters lean over to whisper something to James Liu. Sarah's stomach clenched, sure they were discussing her mistakes, cataloging her inadequacies. She took a deep breath and launched into the Brahms, determined to finish strong regardless of what they thought. The Brahms was fire and shadow, passion barely contained beneath a veneer of classical structure. Sarah's hands flew across the keys, attacking the dramatic sections with newfound confidence. then pulling back to whisper soft passages that hung in the air like secrets. This was the piece she had practiced most intensively, and it showed. She navigated the technical challenges smoothly, and more importantly, she told a story with the music, taking the judges on an emotional journey from turbulence to resolution. The final chord rang out and slowly faded into silence. Sarah sat very still, her hands resting in her lap, afraid to look at the judges. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. Then Dr. Winters spoke, her voice crisp and professional, asking Sarah to tell them about her training. Sarah explained her background honestly. The childhood lessons with her grandmother, the years away from music, the gala where Robert had discovered her. She expected judgment or dismissal, but instead saw something that might have been interest flicker across Dr. Winters' face. The professor asked detailed questions about her grandmother's teaching methods, about how Sarah approached learning new pieces, about her musical influences and goals. James Liu joined the conversation, asking Sarah to play a short section of the Brahms again, this time with a different interpretive approach. He demonstrated what he meant on the piano, showing her how a subtle change in dynamics could shift the emotional weight of a phrase. Sarah tried it his way, then experimented with her own variation. They went back and forth for several minutes, discussing musical choices like colleagues rather than judge and supplicant. Robert remained quiet during this exchange, but Sarah caught him smiling when she glanced his way. The conversation eventually wound down, and Dr. Winters thanked Sarah for her time. The professor's tone was impossible to read, giving no indication of whether the audition had been successful or a complete failure. Sarah was dismissed while the judges deliberated. She waited in the hallway, pacing back and forth on the polished marble floor. Every doubt she had ever harbored about her abilities came flooding back. She was too old to be starting a serious music career. Her training was incomplete and informal. She had no connections, no credentials, nothing but raw talent and desperate hope. What had made her think she could compete with people who had been studying at conservatories since childhood? 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. Finally, the recital hall door opened and Robert emerged. His expression was unreadable as he approached, and Sarah's heart sank. This was it. The moment where her dreams would be crushed and she would return to her small life, forever wondering what might have been if only she had been good enough. But then Robert broke into a broad smile. He told her the judges had been impressed, very impressed. Her technical skills needed work, certainly, but her musicality was exceptional, and her potential was undeniable. Dr. Winters had specifically commented on Sarah's ability to communicate emotion through her playing, calling it a rare gift that couldn't be taught. James Liu had said her interpretation of the Brahms showed genuine artistic insight. The Chen Foundation was offering her a full scholarship to the summer intensive program, Robert announced. 3 months of intensive study with master teachers, culminating in a public recital that would be attended by critics, music professionals, and potential patrons. Housing and a small stipend for living expenses would be included, so she wouldn't have to worry about working during the program. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as the reality of what Robert was saying sank in. This was really happening. She was being given a chance to pursue the dream she had abandoned, the future she had mourned as impossible. Her grandmother's faith in her was being validated in the most unexpected way, years after it had seemed like that faith had been misplaced. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation and transition. Sarah had to give notice at the Riverside Hotel, a conversation that proved both easier and harder than she expected. Mrs. Patterson accepted her resignation with surprising grace, even admitting that she had always known Sarah was destined for something beyond serving champagne to wealthy guests. The other servers threw her a small farewell party in the employee break room, with a cheap cake and heartfelt wishes for success. Maria hugged her tightly on Sarah's last day, making her promise to send updates about the program. The maintenance crew gave her a card they had all signed. Even the head chef came out of the kitchen to shake her hand and tell her he had always known there was something special about her. Sarah realized that while she had felt invisible for years, these people had actually seen her all along. She just hadn't been looking in the right places. The summer intensive program began in early June at a campus on the outskirts of the city. The facility was purpose-built for music education, with practice rooms, performance halls, and student housing, all contained within a cluster of modern buildings surrounded by gardens and walking paths. Sarah arrived with a single suitcase containing all her belongings. Feeling like an imposter among the other participants who wheeled in expensive luggage and carried instrument cases that cost more than her monthly rent used to be. There were 20 students in the program, ranging in age from 19 to 35, though Sarah and one other woman were the only ones over 25. Most of the younger participants were recent conservatory graduates or current graduate students looking to refine their skills before launching professional careers. They spoke casually about competitions they had won, prestigious teachers they had studied with, performances they had given at notable venues. Sarah's roommate was a 22-year-old named Emily, who had attended Juilliard and played with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. The first time Emily heard Sarah practice, she stopped outside their shared door and listened with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite interpret. Later, Emily admitted that Sarah's playing had made her cry, something that never happened when she listened to technically perfect performances by her conservatory peers. The program was more rigorous than Sarah had imagined. Days began at 7 in the morning with group lessons on music theory and history. Individual practice time was scheduled for 4 hours daily, monitored by teaching assistants who took notes on progress and challenges. Afternoons brought master classes with visiting artists, sessions where students performed for the group and received feedback that ranged from encouraging to brutally honest. Dr. Winters was Sarah's primary instructor, and their first private lesson set the tone for what would be an intense but transformative relationship. The professor was exacting in her standards, stopping Sarah mid-phrase to correct hand position, fingering choices, pedal technique. But beneath the stern exterior, Sarah began to recognize genuine care and investment in her development. Dr. Winters saw Sarah's potential and was determined to help her achieve it, even if the process was sometimes painful. The technical gaps in Sarah's training became painfully obvious during those first weeks. Concepts that other students took for granted were foreign to her. Her sight reading was slow compared to her peers. Her knowledge of music theory had huge holes where her grandmother's informal lessons had never ventured. Sarah spent extra hours in the practice rooms, often working past midnight to catch up, driven by a fear that she would be exposed as unworthy of her place in the program. But something else emerged during those grueling weeks. While Sarah struggled with technical exercises, she excelled in interpretive work. When the class analyzed scores to understand a composer's intentions, Sarah's insights were often the most perceptive. When students performed in master classes, Sarah's playing consistently moved people in ways that technically superior performances did not. James Liu, who taught a weekly seminar on performance psychology, started using her recordings as examples of what it meant to connect emotionally with an audience. The other students' attitudes towards Sarah evolved over time. Initial curiosity about the mysterious older student with the unusual background gave way to respect as they heard her play and saw her dedication. Emily became a genuine friend, helping Sarah with theory homework and listening to her practice, offering technical advice without condescension. A pianist named David, who had won multiple national competitions, started seeking Sarah's opinion on his interpretations, valuing her fresh perspective. About halfway through the program, Robert Chen visited to observe a masterclass. Sarah performed a Schubert impromptu she had been working on, pouring everything she had learned into the piece. When she finished, the room fell silent in that particular way that meant something special had just happened. Dr. Winters, who rarely gave unqualified praise, told Sarah it was a breakthrough performance, the moment where technique and emotion had finally merged into artistry. Robert approached Sarah after the class, his eyes bright with satisfaction. He told her he had been right about her potential, that the investment the foundation had made was already proving worthwhile. But he also warned her that the real challenge was still ahead. The final recital at the end of the program would be her introduction to the professional music world. Critics would be there, as would donors, concert organizers, and representatives from artist management companies. Her performance could open doors, but only if she was ready. The pressure of that knowledge settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical weight. The final recital was 4 weeks away, and she still had to choose her program and perfect every piece to performance standard. Dr. Winters helped her select a challenging but achievable set: a Bach partita, 2 Debussy preludes, and the Brahms intermezzo she had played at her audition. The professor wanted to showcase both Sarah's technical growth and her natural musicality, creating a narrative arc from Baroque precision to romantic passion. Sarah practiced obsessively those final weeks, sometimes forgetting to eat or sleep as she worked through problem passages. Emily would drag her to meals and force her to take breaks, reminding her that exhaustion would hurt her performance more than a few extra hours of practice would help. But Sarah couldn't stop. This recital felt like her one chance to prove she belonged in this world, to honor her grandmother's faith, to justify all the years she had spent serving others instead of pursuing her own dreams. 3 days before the recital, Sarah hit a wall. Nothing she played sounded right. Her fingers stumbled over passages she had mastered weeks ago. The music that had once flowed effortlessly now felt forced and artificial. She left the practice room in tears, convinced she was going to fail, that she had been foolish to think she could transform from a waitress into a serious musician in just 3 months. Dr. Winters found her sitting on a bench in the garden, staring at nothing. The professor sat down beside her without speaking for several minutes, just sharing the space and the silence. Finally, Dr. Winters spoke, telling Sarah about her own first major recital decades ago. She had been so paralyzed by fear that she almost didn't go on stage. What saved her was remembering why she played music in the first place, not to impress anyone or prove anything, but because music was how she understood the world and herself. The professor reminded Sarah that the recital wasn't a test she could fail. It was an opportunity to share her gift with people who wanted to hear it. The critics and industry professionals in attendance would be looking for artistry and authenticity, not technical perfection. They wanted to be moved, to feel something, and that was what Sarah did best. Dr. Winters told her to stop trying so hard and trust the musicality that had brought her to this moment. That conversation shifted something fundamental in Sarah's approach. She stopped drilling technical passages and instead played through her pieces with joy, remembering what she loved about each one, finding the emotional core that had drawn her to select them. The music came alive again, not perfect but genuine, speaking in a voice that was unmistakably hers. The recital hall filled with people on the evening of Sarah's performance, every seat occupied and several attendees standing in the back. Sarah watched from backstage as the audience settled, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She recognized Robert Chen in the front row, along with Dr. Winters and James Liu. Her fellow program participants sat together several rows back, Emily giving her an encouraging thumbs up when their eyes met. But there were many unfamiliar faces too. Sarah could identify the critics by their notebooks and serious expressions. Concert organizers and artist managers were scattered throughout the audience, some checking phones, others chatting quietly with neighbors. This was not a friendly gathering of supporters but a professional evaluation, and the stakes felt impossibly high. One poor performance could close doors before they even opened. One moment of panic could waste everything she had worked for. Backstage, Sarah paced in her floor-length black gown, a gift from Robert that made her feel elegant and capable. Her hands were icy despite the warm evening, and she flexed her fingers repeatedly to keep them loose. The stage manager gave her a 5-minute warning, and Sarah closed her eyes, centering herself the way Dr. Winters had taught her. She thought about her grandmother, imagining the older woman sitting in the audience ready to hear the musician Sarah had become. The stage manager gave the signal, and Sarah walked onto the stage. The applause was polite but measured, appropriate for someone unknown. She sat at the gleaming grand piano, adjusted the bench, and took a deep breath. The audience quieted, waiting. This was it. The moment when her new life would truly begin or end before it had properly started. She began with the Bach partita, her fingers moving through the complex contrapuntal lines with newfound confidence. The piece was technically demanding, full of rapid passages and intricate voice leading, but Sarah navigated it cleanly. More importantly, she brought out the architecture of the music, making listeners hear how Bach had constructed something magnificent from mathematical principles and profound faith. The Baroque precision was there, but so was human warmth. As Sarah moved into the second movement, she felt something shift inside her. The nervousness didn't disappear, but it transformed into focused energy. Her awareness expanded to include the audience, feeling their attention like a physical presence, playing not just for herself, but for them. creating a shared experience. This was what her grandmother had meant about music being a conversation, a dialogue between performer and listener that transcended words. The Bach ended to enthusiastic applause, more genuine than the polite greeting she had received when walking on stage. Sarah allowed herself a small smile before launching into the first Debussy prelude. This was music of suggestion and atmosphere, impressionistic sketches that required delicate touch and sensitive pedal work. Sarah had practiced these pieces until her understanding of them went beyond notes on a page to something intuitive and felt. She played Debussy as if painting with sound, creating shimmering textures and mysterious harmonies that seemed to hover in the air. The audience leaned forward slightly, drawn into the intimate sound world Sarah was creating. She moved seamlessly into the second prelude, maintaining the spell, showing different facets of Debussy's genius. When she finished, there was a moment of held breath before applause broke out, and Sarah heard someone in the audience whisper that her interpretation was extraordinary, but the real test was still ahead. The Brahms intermezzo that concluded her program was the piece that would define the entire performance. This was music that demanded both technical mastery and deep emotional engagement, that asked the performer to bare their soul and trust the audience to understand. Sarah had chosen it deliberately, wanting to end with something that represented who she truly was as a musician. She took a longer pause before beginning, letting the silence build anticipation. When her hands finally descended to the keys, it was with complete commitment. The opening phrases were turbulent, almost angry, reflecting the struggle and frustration of Brahms' later years. Sarah leaned into that darkness, not shying away from the painful emotions embedded in the music. But then the piece shifted to its lyrical middle section, and Sarah's playing transformed. This was pure longing, bittersweet and beautiful, speaking of love and loss in a language everyone understood even if they couldn't articulate it. She thought of all the years she had spent away from music, the dreams she had buried, the version of herself she had almost lost forever. That personal history flowed through her fingers into the music, making it achingly real. The technical passages in the final section came easily now because Sarah wasn't thinking about technique. She was thinking about the journey from darkness to light, from despair to hope, from loneliness to connection. The music built to its climax with power and passion, then settled into a peaceful resolution that felt earned rather than imposed. Sarah played the final chords and let them fade completely into silence before lifting her hands from the keys. The audience erupted. People rose to their feet immediately, applause thundering through the hall. Sarah stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the response, tears streaming down her face. She looked out at the standing crowd and saw that many of them were crying too. Robert Chen had his hand over his heart. Dr. Winters was openly weeping, her stern facade completely dissolved. Emily and the other program participants were cheering, and even the critics in their front row seats were applauding with enthusiasm rather than professional reserve. Sarah took several bows as the applause continued, then made her way off stage on shaky legs. Backstage, she collapsed into a chair, adrenaline draining away and leaving her exhausted but euphoric. She had done it. She had stood in front of critics and professionals and skeptics, and she had made them feel something. She had proven that she belonged. Dr. Winters was the first to reach her backstage, pulling Sarah into an unexpected embrace. The professor told her that in 40 years of teaching, she had rarely witnessed a performance of such raw emotional power. Sarah had taken risks with her interpretation, had made choices that could have failed spectacularly, but instead had created something transcendent. The professor was proud beyond words. Other well-wishers followed. James Liu congratulated her warmly, saying her performance had reminded him why he had become a musician in the first place. Her fellow students surrounded her with hugs and excited chatter, celebrating her success as if it were their own. Robert Chen waited until the initial crowd dispersed, then approached with his gentle smile. He told Sarah that everything was about to change for her, that opportunities would start coming, but she should remember this moment when music was still pure and uncomplicated by professional pressures. The reception after the recital was crowded with people wanting to meet Sarah. Concert. Organizers offered performance dates. A representative from a prestigious artist management company asked if she had representation and handed her a business card with a personal cell number. Critics who had seemed intimidating from the stage proved friendly and complimentary in person. several saying they would be writing glowing reviews. But the conversation that mattered most came from an elderly woman who approached Sarah near the end of the evening. The woman had silver hair and kind eyes that seemed familiar somehow. She introduced herself as Catherine Morrison, and Sarah's grandmother had been her piano teacher 60 years ago. Catherine had seen Sarah's grandmother's name in the program notes and had come to the recital, hoping to hear echoes of her beloved teacher in her granddaughter's playing. Catherine told Sarah that her grandmother would have been so proud that Sarah had not only inherited her technical teaching, but also her gift for touching hearts through music. She shared memories of lessons in that small apartment, the same lessons that had shaped Sarah's childhood, creating a connection across generations. Before leaving, Catherine pressed an old photograph into Sarah's hand. It showed a young woman at a piano, Sarah's grandmother decades ago, looking just like Sarah did now. 6 months after the recital, Sarah sat in her new apartment in the city, a modest but comfortable space she could actually afford thanks to the income from regular performances and teaching. The photograph Catherine had given her hung on the wall above her upright piano, her grandmother's young face watching over her practice sessions. Sarah often looked at that image when she needed encouragement, seeing in her grandmother's expression the same determination and joy she now felt in her own musical journey. The months following the summer program had been both exhilarating and overwhelming. The positive reviews from the recital had opened doors Sarah could never have imagined walking through as a waitress at the Riverside Hotel. She had performed at several small but prestigious venues around the region, building a reputation as a pianist who combined technical skill with rare emotional depth. The artist management company that had approached her after the recital had signed her as a client, helping her navigate the complex professional landscape of the classical music world. Most surprisingly, Sarah had been invited to give a recital at the city's main concert hall, a venue she had passed countless times but never dreamed of performing in. The recital was scheduled for next month, and Sarah was preparing a program that included works by Schumann, Ravel, and of course the Brahms intermezzo that had become something of a signature piece for her. The concert was already selling well, driven by word of mouth and the growing recognition of her name in local music circles. But success had brought unexpected challenges. Sarah sometimes felt pressure to recreate the emotional intensity of that first breakthrough performance, to deliver transcendent experiences every time she sat at a piano. Dr. Winters, who had become not just a teacher but a mentor and friend, reminded her regularly that consistency was more important than fireworks, that building a sustainable career required patience and professionalism alongside artistry. Sarah had also begun teaching piano herself, something she had never expected to enjoy as much as she did. 3 evenings a week, students came to her apartment for lessons. Some were children just starting out, reminding her of herself at that age, full of potential and dreams. Others were adults who had always wanted to learn piano, but had never found the time. People whose stories resonated with her own late start to professional music. Teaching forced Sarah to articulate the intuitive understanding she had of music, to break down concepts she had absorbed unconsciously, and in the process, she became a better musician herself. The Chen Foundation continued to support her, not just financially but through connections and opportunities. Robert Chen had become something like a grandfather figure, checking in regularly, attending her performances, and introducing her to people who could further her career. He had told her recently that her success was one of his proudest achievements as a patron, that discovering her at the Gala had reminded him why he dedicated his life to supporting the arts. Sarah had also maintained contact with her fellow students from the summer program. Emily was pursuing graduate studies at a conservatory in Europe, and they video chatted regularly, sharing their triumphs and struggles. David had won another major competition and was beginning an international touring career. The bonds formed during those intense months of study and growth had proven lasting, creating a network of mutual support that Sarah valued deeply. Sometimes Sarah thought about the gala where everything had changed, about the moment when Mrs. Patterson had given her permission to play the old piano. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet also like yesterday. She had recently returned to the Riverside Hotel for a visit, walking through the grand ballroom where she used to serve champagne. Maria had screamed with delight at seeing her, hugging her tightly and demanding to hear every detail of her new life. The old piano still sat in the corner of the ballroom, waiting for its next chance to sing. Sarah had asked Mrs. Patterson if she could play it one more time, and her former supervisor had agreed with a warmth that would have been unthinkable in their old employer-employee relationship. Sarah had played for the hotel staff during their break, surrounded by people who had known her as a server, but now saw her as a successful musician. The pride and genuine happiness on their faces had meant more to her than the applause of sophisticated audiences. That visit had crystallized something for Sarah. Success wasn't just about recitals in prestigious concert halls or reviews in important publications. It was about the journey from who she had been to who she was becoming, about honoring the dreams her grandmother had planted in her heart, about having the courage to claim the life she was meant to live even when the path seemed impossible. Sarah's upcoming concert hall recital would be a milestone, certainly, but it wasn't the destination. There would be more performances after that, more students to teach, more music to learn and interpret and share. The career she was building would have ups and downs, successes and disappointments, moments of transcendence and stretches of ordinary work. That was okay. That was what a real life in music looked like. She had framed a program from the Gala and hung it near her grandmother's photograph. The elegant design listed the evening's entertainment, including a note at the bottom. Live piano music provided by Sarah Mitchell. It was the first time her name had appeared in print as a musician, and looking at it still gave her chills. That single line represented the moment when possibility became reality, when a chance offer to play an old piano had changed everything. The night before the gala, Sarah had been a waitress who played piano in her mind, imagining performances she would never give for audiences she would never reach. Now she was a pianist who sometimes remembered being a waitress, grateful for that experience because it had taught her resilience, humility, and the value of being truly seen. Both versions of herself were real, and both had value. She didn't have to erase the waitress to become the pianist. They were part of the same story, the same journey. As Sarah practiced that evening, preparing for her concert hall debut, she thought about all the people who had helped her along the way, her grandmother, who had given her the foundation, Mrs. Patterson, who had said yes when she could have said no, Robert Chen, who had seen potential where others saw only a server, Dr. Winters, who had pushed her to grow beyond what seemed possible, her fellow students who had accepted and encouraged her, Catherine, who had connected her to her grandmother's legacy. But she also thought about her own courage, the bravery it had taken to offer to play at the gala, to accept the audition, to walk away from the security of her serving job to pursue an uncertain dream. Sarah had saved herself, with help from others certainly, but ultimately through her own willingness to risk failure in pursuit of something that mattered more than safety. The music flowed from her fingers as the last light of day faded from her apartment windows. Sarah played not for critics or concert organizers or potential patrons, but for herself and her grandmother, and every person who had ever set aside a dream and wondered if it was too late to reach for it again. She played to say that it's never too late, that opportunities can appear in unexpected moments, that saying yes to yourself might be the most important thing you ever do. Outside her window, the city hummed with evening activity. Somewhere out there, other people were serving champagne at galas, wondering if their lives would ever be different. Somewhere, other dreamers were waiting for their moment, their chance, to step into the light and show the world who they really were. Sarah's story wasn't special because she was uniquely talented or lucky. It was special because she had recognized her moment when it came, and had found the courage to seize it. Tomorrow she would practice some more. Next week she would teach her students and perform at a small venue across town. Next month she would walk onto the stage at the city's concert hall and play for the largest audience of her career. But tonight, alone in her apartment with her grandmother's photograph watching over her, Sarah played simply because she loved music, because it was who she was meant to be, because the journey from waitress to pianist had taught her that transformation was possible at any age, in any circumstance, if you were brave enough to believe in yourself. The last notes of her practice session faded into the evening quiet. Sarah lifted her hands from the keys and smiled, completely at peace with where she had been, where she was, and wherever the music would take her next.